mentioned this as well, is that I think for most of us looking at Bahrain, we're trying to be helpful. I mean, we're looking at a country that has a lot of great aspects. When I was able to travel freely to Bahrain, I really enjoyed going there probably as much as any country in the region or more. It has, for those who haven't traveled there, it's got a much freer feeling than other Gulf countries, much more interesting population. It's more diverse than most other Gulf countries. And Bahrainians, just generally speaking, are often very outgoing and friendly and interesting, and you can start up a lot of great conversations there. And that is not just opposition members, I'm talking about members of the government, ministers. I've met many of them in the past. However, it's hard for the Bahraini authorities, government, official people, to see any kind of criticism as constructive. And I think that the recommendations that all of us have offered today are in the spirit of constructive criticism, saying that if the country followed not some kind of theoretical perfect norms, but just even were following the relatively modest steps that have been followed in much of the rest of the region. I'll just mention places like Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon, just as examples of countries that have, and those are all countries that perceive themselves as liberalizing or democratizing slowly. If Bahrain even followed the examples of these sort of slow democratizers, a couple of them, Jordan and Morocco, also kingdoms that are moving toward their version of constitutional monarchy. If Bahrain just tried to follow those examples, they would do well. The people, as we mentioned earlier, are not looking for a lot. They're just looking, especially the majority Shia population, is looking for a sense that they can participate and that their voices count. And I think that asking for the Shia voices in Bahrain to count, asking for the government to not give up power, but to just allow a lower house to have influence on the decisions that affect people's everyday lives, it's not too big an ask. So yes, you'll get pushback if you make a statement, but I think you just kind of have to stick to your guns, because I don't think anyone here is asking for anything that will ever lead to the downfall of the country, or even frankly to the downfall of the current rulers. I think it's just asking for a more fair situation where every citizen has some kind of chance to participate in the decisions that affect them.
Thank you. I would just add that Bahrain is one of the few countries in the Gulf that actually the citizens, there is a working class of citizens, okay? If you go to Qatar or UAE, the citizens do not work. The work is all done by expatriates. Bahrain, there is a real working class. They have factories. It is much more of all the socioeconomic striations of the citizenry. I'm sorry, would you
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Just to jump off of where you left off there, that I think that certainly Bahrain has long been a country where there have been a lot of opportunities for there has been this space that had existed for civil society, for some independent press, for political societies and labor movements. And because it had been that one corner of the Gulf where all of that was possible, it's always the corner of the Gulf where there is the most potential for positive steps to be taken. But we've seen certainly recently all of that has been going in the opposite direction, closing off those spaces. But while those spaces still exist, they certainly need to be protected. And I think that some of the recommendations that we've been making and have been suggesting that Congress also make, releasing political prisoners, this may sound like a sort of a big ask, but this is also not unprecedented for Bahrain in recent memory. Back in 2002, there was a big mass amnesty when the king was elevated from emir and was made into a king. There was a big mass amnesty. All the political prisoners were released. People from exile were allowed to return. People whose citizenship were revoked were restored. There was this big opening up, and so this is certainly possible under under the current government, and this is again not unprecedented. But in terms of looking at statements and pressure, I think that it's important for we've seen how Bahrain has responded to pressure. Both from the U.S. in particular, but also then from the international community, and I think that more broadly, from 2011, 2012 until late 2015, early 2016, we saw quite a bit of international scrutiny and repeated pressure at the United Nations on Bahrain's human rights record. We saw U.S. pressure and engagement, pressure from the British as well. But then when we started seeing some of that attention decrease and more space allowed for Bahrain to sort of do whatever it wanted to, and things really started escalating heavily in June 2016 onward, without much of a response from either the international community or the U.S. And I think with the U.S. being one of Bahrain's key allies and such a visible partner with the Fifth Fleet being based in Bahrain, it's imperative that the U.S. be a leader in recognizing when we see those abuses happening in Chris.
Thank you. Next question. We have a few more minutes. Is that an answer? No? So something. Okay, well, the panelists want to. Oh, go ahead.
Here. Hi, I'm Clarissa for the Lantos Human Rights Commission. So one question I have is, do you think that international pressure would be effective for Bahrain? And I know you guys can kind of touch on it a little bit, but what exactly do you think that would look like in an effective form for them to respond to? I know there's a lot that can go on, and recently in the past, Bahrain has responded to international pressure but also set back on it. So what do you think would be something which we can truly uphold?
Well, from the international side, there has been certain engagement from sort of the international human rights mechanisms on Bahrain's record, these sort of independent bodies. I mentioned the Human Rights Committee is currently reviewing Bahrain's treaty obligations under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which is particularly timely given the upcoming elections and the amount of political repression that we've seen. But those bodies of independent human rights experts will sort of come out with a report and a set of recommendations later this year, or later this month, actually, which then is a great tool for whether it's the U.S. government or other governments internationally, to follow up on those recommendations to say, this has been assessed as where you have not been upholding your treaty obligations. This is the things that you need to do in order to come in line with those obligations. These are the things that we expect out of you, and in terms of you are a close ally, and we can be honest and straightforward amongst friends that these steps need to be taken. The Universal Periodic Review is also another mechanism that came out with 176 recommendations for Bahrain last year, covering a wide range of civil and political rights, as well as just a broad range of all sort of human rights. And then even going back to 2011, I think that it's certainly important not to forget the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, which was commissioned by the King. It was accepted by the King. It was a good report from legitimate independent human rights experts that came out with 26 different wide-ranging recommendations for reforms. And yet, here we are 7 years later, we have not seen these reforms implemented, and these are, from that were commissioned by the King himself. So, Bahrain needs to be held accountable for even implementing those sorts of recommendations too. And I think that there's been attention here in Congress around those recommendations in the past, and including required reporting from the State Department on its assessment of whether or not these recommendations have been implemented and to what extent. And hopefully that can be useful in determining U.S. engagement with Bahrain around these issues and encouraging further reform. But I think there's certainly a lot of these international tools that exist that the U.S. government and through congressional oversight can continue to follow up on.
I agree with everything was said. At NDI, we concentrate primarily on political reform and democracy, and not as much or very little on the human rights conventions and tools. But I would just reiterate that in Bahrain, the peaceful opposition and peaceful opposition leaders moderate opposition leaders have been, their societies have been dissolved. The leaders who have put in jail, he's out of jail now, but Ibrahim al-Sharif, who was the head of WAD, is a small L liberal, moderate-minded gentleman. Was invited to be part of panels by NDI at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 2000, and in Boston 4 years later has met President Obama. I mean, these are very mainstream moderate political leaders who are in jail and so on. So I think the asks are very low, and I think typically the United States and other similar situations where political leaders who are moderate and very friendly to the United States and other countries who are devoted to working within the rules of a normal political system, they typically get more support than they have in Bahrain. So I think very strong statements in support of a political system that includes peaceful leaders who have agreed to stay within the parameters of reasonable laws that conform to international norms would be a good start. I would just add the comment that typically these asks have to be associated with, there have to be carrots and sticks. The stick, in the case of Bahrain, is almost without question security assistance and arms sales, and that's the leverage, and it's leverage that we've seen can work, for example, in Egypt, where it does work as soon as they're actually not the threat of withholding, as soon as the funding is withheld, then Egypt changes a lot of its tune on democracy issues. I think Bahrain would be the same thing.
And that's a good place for me to jump in on this. So I think before I sort of get in, and I completely agree. I mean, the U.S. Place for leverage is in security assistance, military aid. It's important to sustain it. I think what we've seen in the past is sort of backing down on holds or freezes without many concessions. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that with the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, it's a major investment by the United States that makes Bahrain important, but also sort of binds the United States to the country. You're talking about, over the past decade or two, $2 billion investment into the naval base, $580 million just within the last 7 years of improvements. This gives the United States other leverage. You're talking about personnel who live on and off base, so that is playing into the Bahraini economy. But it is a challenge because you have sort of roots drawn in Bahrain that make it difficult to leave, and you also have a Bahraini foreign policy that has tended to support U.S. counterterrorism, whether it's with the counter-ISIS coalition in Iraq back in 2003. There's been sort of sustained support on counterterrorism financing, and these sorts of things. Bahrainis have been aligned with the U.S. With that said, I mean, ultimately, U.S. interest needs to be understood is a democratic, a Bahrain that is stable and allows its people to express themselves freely. That is ultimately the best ally that the United States can have, and so it's important for it to use and sustain the leverage that it does have in security assistance and arms sales, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
If I could just jump in on one last thing, going back to some of those individual cases and being able to look at some of those leaders and engage on those cases. Certainly the Tom Lantos Commission has its Defending Freedom project and the prisoners of conscience that are that have been sort of vetted through the commission. And I would note that Sheikh Ali Salman, the Secretary General of Al Wafaq, who's continuing to serve an arbitrary prison sentence, and who the government is now continuing to seek a death sentence against, he is already on the Tom Lantos Commission's list and has not been adopted by a member of Congress. In terms of civil society surrounding the sort of election process, two human rights defenders, Dr. Abdul Singais and Abdulhadi Khawaja, are also on that list and also have not been adopted. Or in terms of free press, even the photojournalist Ahmed Humaydan also again is on the commission's list without a member of Congress adopting them. That's just certainly another way that members of Congress here can continue to engage on these certain issues too.
Thank you. Just to pick up on the Bahrain government has also been fairly clever, in playing into the Iran narrative that not only Mr. Trump, but Mr. Obama, to a certain extent, finding arms caches, finding arms supplies, Iran capturing an Iranian boat, delivering arms to the underground, so Bahrain, who knows, they have exposed some of these arms, but they know how to play the game as far as what the United States government, what the sort of push the USG buttons on Iran. They know how to do that. So, just the last question, we're going to end up pretty soon. So, I mentioned Prime Minister Khalifa. He's sitting there. His basic position is, if we give the Shia opposition something, they're going to ask for more. Then you give them that, then they're going to ask for more. And then, before you know it, we're out of here. We're on a plane out. That is his thinking. If you were in a meeting with Prime Minister Khalifa, how do you answer his narrative?
Try to start. Well, actually, just before I will answer that question, but just before I do that, the previous question reminded me of an anecdote that I'll share, just about where the points of influence are, how you can press the buttons. Quite a number of years ago, I was in a meeting in Bahrain with the king, with Madeleine Albright, who's the chair of NPI's board, and we sat in a small meeting room with him, and on his wall, I realized, because I wasn't doing the talking, I was just sitting there looking, and I realized were photos of admirals of the Fifth Fleet, a number of them, a succession of admirals of the Fifth Fleet on his wall. And it was a time where Madeleine was not too long ago Secretary of State, and I thought to myself, the king doesn't have photos of previous United States Secretaries of State or even previous United States presidents. He has photos of previous admirals of the Fifth Fleet. And I joked later as we left the meeting, saying, I have the feeling that if this were the admiral of the Fifth Fleet in this meeting, that he wouldn't have been quite so quick to brush off the concerns. But to answer your question, because we basically made the same pitch to the king. We said that if you think of kingdoms, and I think Bahrain calls itself a kingdom, but it's obviously not in the same league as Great Britain or Denmark or something like that. But if you think of the great constitutional monarchies, and they do talk about constitutional monarchies, Denmark, England, the United Kingdom, Spain. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the ruler gets much greater prestige when the ruler takes on the prerogatives of the royalty and does not govern, but sits back and becomes the conscience of the nation, such as in Spain. Becomes sort of unimpeachable in terms of integrity, like it is in Denmark and loved by all the citizens, or is the holder of all of the sovereign touchstones, like it is in England with the Queen and the monarchy. So we did say to the king, and I'd say the same thing to the Prime Minister, the longevity of the ruling family of Bahrain and its prestige is wrapped up in their ability to step back from governing and to take on what's important to the country, represent what's important to the long-term health of the country, and not meddle in the day-to-day governing. The Prime Minister should be an independent person who could ask the king for advice. The king there could be powers, for example, of dissolving the parliament, which is typical actually in constitutional monarchies. So I think my answer would be to the Prime Minister, look at the great examples of constitutional monarchies, and just the three that jump out are United Kingdom, Denmark, and Spain, and try to emulate that model, not in 1 year, but over some period of time.
And I would kind of continue off of that point, again, looking back at even just recent history in terms of this being a possibility that following that sort of mass amnesty that I mentioned previously, the king's prestige in Bahrain among all communities was shot up, in that time period. He went into Shia villages and was greeted by, welcoming crowds, and he was lifted up, by a crowd and sort of, praising his role at that time. Clearly, things have gone very far away from that time period, but, it's certainly possible if you are going to be, taking the concerns of the citizens, as legitimate, and working to improve the rights of all Bahrainis, not certain constituencies.
Okay, what changed? I mean, okay, so that was his approach after what changed? What caused this reversal, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think that we saw, as mentioned here, that in seeing the amount of representation by opposition and their, criticism of a lot of these sort of pocketbook issues, I think that we've seen a lot of how the royal family in particular is very sensitive to criticism, especially when it comes to corruption issues, and some of those sorts of concerns that were raised by the previous parliament, and I think it sort of started there. And
What about the Saudis? Did they play any role in this reversal, or?
I don't know, I can't speak to any sort of overt role, but I mean, I certainly, you've seen how even within the royal family's internal politics, where you have more hardliners versus some of the more moderate reformers, it's, sort of discussed that the Saudis would rather see, the hardliners strengthened within that. And certainly we saw the role that the Saudis then played in 2011, coming in with all of these troops and everything, and showing tangibly that they're not afraid to come in to be the guarantor of the monarchy generally, but also of whichever elements within that they prefer. And that's certainly reflected both in troops as well as the great financial support that they have for.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudi view is the GCC, which has got its own problems there. Their view is it is a Sunni organization. There is not going to be a Shia government in the GCC, and if we have to kick it's really, so that you're sort of fighting that with some of your recommendations, but anyway.
Well, just jump in on that. I would also say that it was pretty clear in that period, 2006 to 2010, that the Saudis were not interested in a successful democratic experiment in the Gulf. And they can put up with Kuwait, which has had, first of all, a longer history, but also really works within its boundaries and is very insular, frankly, and kind of minds its own business to a large extent, and has a lot of money and can pay its own way. They put up with Kuwait, but they weren't going to put up with the democratic Bahrain, especially, as you mentioned, with the population that, unlike Kuwait, which is, people are quite privileged and they have their own kind of businesses to deal with. In Bahrain, you have a population of people who would, very much want to break out of their box and seek greater opportunities and so on. So I think they saw democratic Bahrain as a real challenge for sure.
Unless there's is there any last questions?
I just really wanted to ask
Last question. Yeah.
one last
Go to the
question.
mic. Can you go to the mic?
You guys can brush off of this really briefly, but I wanted to ask. My mother was a Sunni, my father was a Shiite. There's a lot of people just explain Sunnis and Shiites policies. What is the Middle East going with all of this? And if there's a civil war, it's going to happen soon, or people just going to live in harmony. I just really wanted to know.